Hi, everyone, and welcome to this latest UK in a Changing Europe lunch hour. We're here to discuss the outcome of the local elections and what they might mean going forward. Got a fantastic panel with me, Hannah Bunting, who is Senior Lecturer at the University of Exeter, Sophie Stowers, who is, let me get this right, because Sophie has abandoned us to take up a new job as Research Manager at More in Common. I will be referring to her as Judas throughout this session as a result. Tony Schrabbers, Professor at the London School of Economics, and last but by no means least, John Curtis, University of Strathclyde, and UK and Change Europe Senior Fellow. As ever, stick your questions in Slido. Also, as ever, vote for the ones you want me to put to the panel, and I'll try and get to as many of them as possible. We've got a question already, which is prompt. But just to start you all off, if I were to say, what are your key couple of takeaways from the locals, where would you start, Hannah?
Yeah, thanks, Anand. I guess mine really is the level of fragmentation and just how much when you break that down and start analysing the results, it mirrors exactly what we experienced in the 2024 general election. So the winner's vote share is down. It's the lowest it's been in at least 80 years. The majorities that they're winning with was the lowest in at least 80 years of local elections. It was at like 11.5% or something like that, down around 10 points from last year's local elections. So everywhere we look really at this set, there has been that fragmentation and this less decisive wins, which again, we saw this in the 2024 general election where it was Labour who was the main beneficiary, but this time it's of course been Reform. And that could be to do with the areas that were up this time, right? There were Conservative heartlands. It wasn't all across the country. And so in those areas, it could be that, yeah, Reform are sort of the leading party there now, even though they're not decisive wins, and they actually did so with a very small majority.
So similar lessons about incumbency as well as general election, and as indeed elections all over the place. Sophie, even I can't be bothered to call you Judas for this whole hour. So Sophie, go on.
Oh, that wore off quickly.
I know.
I think, I mean, we knew that this was going to be maybe an election where Reform did particularly well, but I think they've probably surpassed most people's expectations. And I think one of the things that stands out to me is how successful they've been at broadening their vote out since the election in July last year. So some polling from obviously my favourite employer ever, More in Common, has shown over the weekend that about 2/5 of Reform voters who voted Reform in this round of local elections didn't do so at the general election in July. And so I think that really speaks to Reform and not just, targeting maybe disaffected Conservative voters. Maybe those who voted for Boris Johnson in 2019 didn't want to do it again this time, but they're picking the vote of traditional Conservatives in areas like Kent, absolutely decimated the Tories standing on that really kind of true blue council there. And they're also picking up kind of dregs of voters from Labour in other parts of the country as well. So they're becoming much more kind of effectively spread out across the country. And I think it's just really interesting to look at how they're doing that, how much of that is driven by disaffection with the two main parties and how that translates into national support as well.
Yeah, we'll come back to who, looking forward, they might be the greater threat to, but we'll do that in a minute. Tony? Tony, you're muted.
There's me trying to be a good citizen. I've forgotten the lessons of the lockdown. So I'll just say five things. I'll keep off the psephology for a moment, do some of the more into the future stuff. First to say, we've now got Reform in government, big county government. Counties spend lots of money. They're very important. And they now control several of them. So we're going to see a test of what Reform can do in local government and the certainty that Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats will look very carefully at what they do in order to point out any weaknesses in it. They want to save a lot of money. Truth is, most of the counties that were won by Reform were controlled by the Conservatives, who actually ran quite tight ships. And of course, local government spending less now than it was 15 years ago. So I'm not sure there's that much fat to be cut, and separately, most of the money goes on social care, not on diversity. So that's the first thing. I suspect they'll end up blaming Whitehall for quite a lot of their woes. Next thing to say is that the loss, the culling of dozens and dozens of councillors is going to affect the Conservative Labour Party's activist base. And when it comes to fighting the general election, very important. Big round of local elections next year to see what happens in those. The next thing I'd say is in places where Reform now run the county, and indeed in Lincolnshire, and the mayor, the combined authority mayor, they're going to be leaders in reorganising local government in those areas. That's a big task, which I doubt that the current government thought Reform would be having a major role in, but now they are going to in many parts of England. And so I think if you add all of that together, this is a very important set of elections, partly for the reasons everybody else is going to discuss, but partly because it projects Reform UK, Nigel Farage, his party, into a position where they can be judged in office.
Excellent. Okay, and we'll come back to what it actually means in terms of them governing in office a bit later. But John, last but not least, your thoughts?
We have to talk about Brexit.
Always.
Absolutely. Support for Brexit was very strongly related to estimates of what the outcome in an individual ward was in 2016. They were running at a still perfectly creditable 20% on average in places that voted Remain, but they were running at about 40% in places which were very strongly pro-Leave. In contrast, neither the Conservative support nor Labour support, and markedly no longer the Conservative support, was related to how places voted for Brexit. The parties that occupied the other end of the spectrum were the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, particularly the Liberal Democrats. Ed Davies said his party was representing Middle England. Actually, he's very strongly representing Remainer England. So those are the two groups at the opposite end of the spectrum. As a result of all of this, basically, therefore, the Conservatives and Labour were vulnerable to Reform because because their votes essentially unrelated to level of support for Brexit. Reform did equally well in Conservative and Labour held seats and did equal amounts of damage to both of them, whereas Reform basically found it very, very difficult to take seats off the Greens and the Liberal Democrats because their support in wards that those two parties defending was much lower. Now, I don't think this is necessarily to do with Brexit per se. The point is how people voted in the EU referendum gives you a pretty good idea as to where the character of places with respect to the various culture wars issues. And I think that these results have underlined the importance of that whole aspect of our politics, something which certainly isn't something that makes life any easier for the Conservative and Labour parties.
I mean, you say culture war and you say Brexit. Does this mean Brexit is salient, or just that those values?
No. So the point is that people in places that back Brexit are also the people who are most concerned about immigration. They are the people who are most skeptical about equalities policies, and they are the people who are most keen, who say that, despite who say that, we should be lauding Britain's history and be proud of our country, etc., etc. I mean, all symbolism has been played out in some of the Reform statements since their success in the general election. So the point is that because we've got this measure of how people voted in 2016, which we can play with to get the geographical distribution, it gives us a handle on what are the kinds of places where people with socially conservative views, because it's a mistake to think that Reform is simply an undifferentiated protest vote. Reform's vote is very, very firmly located amongst people who would vote to stay out of the European Union, amongst older people, and amongst those who are broadly of conservative views, and people who have less than educational qualification. And essentially what Reform, I think, have now done, they've basically removed the pro-Johnson coalition. They've taken the pro-Johnson Leave coalition of 2019, and it's now very, very firmly in the Reform camp.
So, Sophie, just on that, I mean, you've got a fairly coherent values coalition, but where do we know from your supposed polling with your new employer, do we know where these people stand on the economics? I mean, they're a more divided camp on that, aren't they?
Well, I think that's the thing, is you've got quite a split between people who had already kind of moved over to Reform before or at the 2024 general election, and those who have joined since. Reform's kind of got this voter coalition that are kind of two distinct groups where they might share those kind of social values, but one tends to be much more economically kind of liberal left-wing than the other. And that's the exact same issue that the Johnson 2019 coalition had, is that when you were talking about Brexit, it was great and that coalition all got along. As soon as those decisions about tax and spend had to be made, we saw them fragment. They have very different views about inequality redistribution. And I think that is something that we see in a similar way amongst this kind of Reform group, which, as John said, is probably not surprising considering it's a lot of the same voters who've been attracted. I think the difference is a lot of those who tend to be more probably pro redistribution, you know, that idea, maybe more left wing in their economic views, they've kind of shifted to the party more recently. And so I think as you see the party begin to kind of grow and expand its vote share and its influence across the country, managing the dynamics of that coalition get a little bit more complicated. And so I think it's much easier for Farage and these council leaders to talk about issues like DEI on councils, because actually talking about something like social care and how it's funded is much more difficult for them.
But Tony, obviously in the process of governing, there are going to be economic decisions that these people have to take that might bring out some of those divisions. But will they be things that we notice? I mean, will they reach the sort of national consciousness that Reform Council in X is split over levels of council tax and investment or something?
I mean, I think Reform will gain more. I mean, the decline of the local media is an issue here, never to be understated. Yeah. The extent to which it used to be possible for regional and local media to keep a beady eye on council meetings. A lot of that's disappeared. Having said that, I do think Reform is interesting enough as a national political challenger party, get it right second time, to mean that what we used to call Fleet Street will spend a certain amount of time looking in detail at the way they perform locally. We've already got an absolute classic about flags and what flags should be hung. Should there be, you know, the Union flag, the St. George's flag? What about the Leicestershire flag? And what about Ukraine? And off we go, pride flags, the lot. So that's all kicked off. So I think that some of this will be seen by the national press as so important now that they'll give more attention to it than they would if it was simply, you know, the Conservatives won Durham by accident or Labour won Devon by accident, which this is definitely not an accident.
Okay, Hannah, I mean, this is a bit of a nerdy question, I suppose, but I mean, Duverger's law has stopped being a law, hasn't it? I mean, it's a sort of set of guidelines, as we might say. I mean, what we have this electoral system that's meant to, you know, meant to sort of lock in this two-party dominance. What the hell's gone wrong or right?
Yeah, I mean, we probably need more than 45 minutes to really get into that. But yeah, I think it's very interesting to see that sort of the reins that the electoral system kind of were holding on this fragmentation have basically been let go now. And I think just picking up on some of the things Tony was just saying, it puts Reform in quite an interesting position now, because they started off very much as an anti-establishment sort of challenger party, whereas now I'm kind of calling them semi-establishment, right? And they've got to now prove themselves and make that transition to, okay, yes, you're gaining votes and you're gaining seats at both levels of government now, but can they really make that transition as a party? Because that's different to the Liberal Democrats doing really well in some areas, because they already are that sort of very established and don't have that anti-establishment sentiment. So how do you know, how do they keep that anti-establishment sort of appeal, but actually really become part of the establishment so that they can keep getting elected? Plus this, which didn't really answer your question on sort of on the electoral system, but yeah, it's a difficult one, because it was for a long time, and even arguably in sort of 2013, 2014, 2015, when we saw lots of fragmentation then, you didn't really see it go into the actual seats won as much, whereas now 2024 general election and this local election, yeah, we're really seeing it that it is translating into seats, not just votes.
Okay, that's really interesting. Now I've got a question from Jill Rutter. I'm not sure which Jill Rutter this is. Are voters expecting reform to deliver change, and will they struggle to do so? I suppose it partly goes back to what you said, Tony, which is where they can, they will, and where they can't, they'll blame central government, presumably.
Well, I mean, if they're subtle and well run from, they have good messaging from the middle of the national party, there are things they could do, which I do think Labour and the Conservatives and indeed other parties are somewhat exposed on. Very interesting research in The Economist this week about how reform voters are particularly concerned by issues like clean streets, antisocial behaviour, graffiti, parks and gardens, grot. Most people are concerned about that, actually, but reform voters particularly so. And I do think that, given that these things, and potholes, famously potholes, these things cost farthings in the great scheme of public spending. But by an accident of the way austerity was delivered, they've been targeted for the worst cuts. And I do think that with relatively small amounts of money, where they control these services, and they don't in the counties, but they will in places like Doncaster, they could set about clean and safe policies in a way that would give them a distinct edge if they could deliver them, and it would give Labour and the Conservatives pause for thought. So that's that, in a sense, that I think is what the polling that The Economist had published this week suggests.
I mean, we've got a lot of questions along the lines of, how confident are you they will be able to govern? I mean, the questions ranging from, how carefully were these people vetted to, we've already seen instances of reform candidates saying, oh my God, we weren't meant to win. I don't want to do this job particularly. I mean, have any of you got a sense of whether they're equipped for the task, these candidates? We just have to wait and see.
I don't want to dominate this, but they do have officers. They've got senior officers in all these councils, just like the civil service at Whitehall. They'll all still be there. They're the professionals who deliver social care, streets, the chief executive. And so they're not bereft of any political, any sort of expert advice. The question will be, do they see them as a blob or do they work with them?
Right. I imagine the answer is you talk about them as a blob, but rely on them quite a lot.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think one obvious reason for raising the question is that in those relatively rare instances where UKIP did begin to form a significant group on some local authorities, there was a rather high incidence of them falling apart. So to that extent, at least, that's one of the reasons for raising the question. And the second problem, of course, is that, well, what Tony is right to say, of course, the professional senior officers are still all there. We are, for the most part, with the obvious exception of one or two people like Andrea Jenkins, a group of political novices all of a sudden, all together, collectively, taking over the responsibility for administration, and that's bound to be a bit of a challenge.
Okay.
I agree with that, David. I mean, you can never underestimate the weary cynicism of senior officials, even in local government. So I think some of them will see it as a bit of a challenge to keep the show on the road, but we'll find this out very, very quickly. You're right.
Okay, I'm on a bit of a roll here, going through the questions on Slido. Sophie, I'm going to ask you, this is slightly unfair maybe, but anyway, let's see. Reform gains were in double figures everywhere apart from Buckinghamshire +3 and Oxfordshire +1. What is it about those two counties that made them different to the others? Do we have any idea?
I mean, Oxfordshire, it's, the Liberal Democrats have always been, I think, traditionally the second party around there to the Conservatives, and they've done very well there. I mean, they've just kind of rehashed the strategy that they had in the general election. I think that kind of John mentioned before of targeting a lot of places which have or had Tory MPs, but will quite strongly remain in the referendum. And so there's quite a lot of kind of latent Lib Dem support to take advantage of there. And I think in areas like Oxfordshire, they've kind of been able to reuse that strategy to their advantage once again. So my presumption would be there's less appetite for reform there because there's not that leave right wing, that's just not that type of constituency.
Okay.
And I think, can I just chip in? I mean, I've looked at some of the results in Buckinghamshire in more detail. And what they suggest, I'd be interested to see what the others think about this, is that there are people who are Conservatives who might be fed up with the Conservative Party, but can't quite bring themselves to vote Liberal Democrat. And they're not that tempted by reform, and they seem to be looking at the pattern of where the Conservatives did best, quite affluent, in fact, very affluent areas indeed.
Okay. There's one interesting question here, which is saying, are we blowing this out of all proportion? That is to say, we've had a relatively small number of local council elections, relatively low turnout, and we're drawing all these massive, or the media are drawing all these massive conclusions about what it means for national politics. Is there a danger we're blowing this out of proportion? John?
All local elections have a relatively low turnout. The turnout in this election averaged about 35%, which is not particularly unusual. It's certainly fair to say that people don't necessarily vote the same way in local elections as general elections. It's certainly true that the Democrats tend to do better. The Greens tend to do better. And I think, one of the $64,000 questions is whether some of the support that Reform got, and there's no little doubt that Reform support is higher than you would expect from the national opinion polls, whether some of it does consist of people who are willing to vote for Reform in local elections, but wouldn't necessarily be able to in general elections. Because they're new kids on the block, we don't know the answer to that question. I think the argument against it is, I think with perhaps only one exception, such polling as was done of either the local elections or of the mayoral contest pretty consistently, even that, we're asking specifically about local vote intention, tended to underestimate Reform.
Okay. Which of the two, well, I was going to say big parties, maybe I have to start choosing my vocabulary. Which of Labour or the Conservatives should be most worried by the results in these local elections? Anna?
Yeah, I would say the Conservatives probably, because I think Labour might be the ones who become the most worried, as in they're the ones who might change their policies more or change their messaging more. But actually, when you look at those winners' vote shares, you've got most people in that ward are not voting for Reform if it's Reform that were the winner. And so actually, it would be better probably for Labour to move further away from Reform and capture those voters that didn't want to vote for Reform locally and therefore probably aren't going to vote for them at a national election either. So it's probably the Conservatives who should be the most worried, but yeah, I expect that it might actually turn out to be the Labour Party.
And you'd expect the Conservatives to be gaining a little bit, wouldn't you, as the opposition party a year in from a general election? Isn't that right, Sophie? Wouldn't you, under normal circumstances? I mean, I know they were coming from a very high base.
Yeah, and I mean, it's still relatively soon. I mean, I know Labour's popularity has plummeted relatively quickly, but I mean, I think it's still probably early days. And as you said, they're coming off such a kind of high kind of performance in 2021 that I think even if their drop in support hadn't have been as severe as it has and continued to be, they would have always lost seats because they've just lost by quite a wide margin in general election. So I think that plays into it. I mean, I think the thing that really stands out and gets to that idea of fragmentation and small party performance is that even where Labour and the Conservatives did win, they won by a much smaller margin than they typically would be winning in these seats. I mean, the number of wards where Labour won 50% or more of the vote compared to 2001 is absolutely plummeted. It's gone from double figures to under 10. So, that's a massive shift in terms of the popularity. So I would be worried that even where, if I'm Labour, even where I have clung on, with the caveat that this is never, an amazing round of local elections for the Labour Party, you're doing so by either such a small margin or thanks to a split on the right and not necessarily because of your own volition.
Go on, Tony.
Well, I'm just looking up the last round of elections in 2022 to get ahead of ourselves for 2026. And of course, John will correct me if any of them, Sophie, Hannah will correct me. It was a year when Labour did very well. So next year, a much bigger round of local elections with Labour defending, certainly in England, substantially more seats than the Conservatives and some new authorities coming along, which would be more unpredictable. So I think that obviously, depending on whether this is just a flash in the pan, it all disappears, though I doubt it by this time next year. The risk to Labour is that they're exposed next year in rounds of local elections on several sides at once. And so this might repeat itself the other way around. So I think it's, too early to say that this is just a flash in the pan, and very hard for me anyway to judge whether this is worse for Labour or the Conservatives, because at the moment Reform appear to be able to take council seats from both of them.
Yeah,
that's the crucial point.
I want to come back.
You have to distinguish between two questions. There's the question of from which of the two larger parties is Reform taking most votes. The answer to that is Reform. Now, a lot of what you see in the party.
Hang on, John. You said the answer to that is Reform. Do you mean Conservatives?
Sorry, the Conservatives. Yeah. So a lot of the movement we have to remember, a lot of the movement we are seeing in these local elections is really movement that happened before the general election, right? So, but if you look at, which is the party that goes down most when Reform do particularly well, the answer is Conservatives. It makes very little difference to Labour's performance how well Reform go up or go down. But that's largely the product of what happened before 2024. That said, it still remained the case, according to the opinion polls, that Reform are finding it easier to pick up votes off the Conservatives than they are off Labour. That said, Reform are now taking some votes off Labour, though Labour's problem is they're losing votes to everybody. But the reason why Reform nevertheless can still attack Labour in terms of seats, and you have to remember that Reform took actually a higher proportion of Labour seats on Thursday than they did the proportion of Conservative seats. So they took more votes off the Conservatives, they took more seats off Labour. And that's because, as I was explaining earlier, support for Reform is just as high in Labour areas as it is in Conservative areas. And therefore, with Labour's vote down as well as the Conservative vote down, they just took votes off everybody. Took seats off everybody.
Just coming back to Tony's point, which I think is a really interesting and important one, which is Labour being challenged on all sides.
Yeah. Labour's problem is, so if you take the average of the opinion polls just before Thursday, you've got 9% of 2024 Labour voters going to Reform. You've got 9% going to the Liberal Democrats. You've got 8% going to the Greens, and you've got about 5 or 6% going to the Conservatives. Labour's problem is that as a party that's very much in the middle, it's at risk of fraying in both directions, and that seems to be precisely what has happened. So you've got a lot of unhappy voters out there who are disappointed with the government, but the direction in which they decide to go seems then to depend on other aspects of their ideological predilection, which is why at the end of the day, I mean, I've never been asked recently, well, what should Labour do in response to this? Should they tack to the left and tack to the right? To which my answer is to find out the way forward, because the fundamental problem this Labour government has, it has no story about itself. It has no narrative. It has never communicated what it's about. Therefore, that's why when the government made unexpected decisions, e.g. and especially the winter fuel allowance, it has resonance, because that's the only thing that really strikes them about this government, is the fact there are one or two decisions it's made, which I certainly didn't. I wasn't quite sure what this Labour Party was about, but I really didn't think they were going to do something like that. That's the only thing that sticks. And until they create, in other words, Labour, I think, ever since under Starmer's leadership, have essentially been trying to work out how to defeat their opponents, rather than trying to work out how to define themselves. The government needs badly to define what it's about and to pursue that path. If it tries constantly to weave in one direction or another, it will demonstrate the lack of strategic direction, the lack of self-confidence that will make it very difficult for it to recover.
I mean, that being said, we should acknowledge the fact that they did win a pretty handsome majority on the back of this strategy at the election last year.
Yeah, but it's only on 35% of the vote. It was very, very clear. It was a very thin vote. It was a vote that did have very little in the way of enthusiasm behind it. Some of us wrote this very clearly afterwards, and it was perfectly clear that this was a government that was an accident waiting to happen. If they could not turn around the economy with the speed that they implied that they could, they're now saying, oh, of course, you can't possibly expect to do it that quickly. But the implication they conveyed to the electorate is they could, inevitably finding it very difficult to turn around the public services. Without that story about what this... I mean, another way of thinking about it is this. Keir Starmer has essentially sold himself as a plumber or as a repairman. He said, oh gosh, you've got leaks in your house, you'd need me to fix them. What voters want from a government is an architect, somebody who's going to build them a new house, give them a sense of purpose and direction. They don't simply want a plumber. And that's the problem that the Labour Party faces.
So this house, Sophie, probably has a sort of conservatory marked tough on immigration appended to it. And that seems to be one of the strategies that Labour is adopting. Is there any evidence that it works in terms of reassuring people who might be tempted to flee Labour to vote Reform?
I mean, my sense is that if the reason that you're voting Reform is because you're concerned on immigration and that's your #1 priority, you're probably too far gone for the Labour Party to win you back anyway at this point. I don't necessarily think on issues like migration there's any point in trying to out Farage, especially when you've got the Conservative Party on the right trying to basically do the same. I think it actually puts you at further risk of alienating voters on the left. And I think, you know, I don't think it's kind of concrete evidence for it, but I was quite interested in the by-election in Runcorn that happened on Thursday too, that it seemed like by kind of campaigning locally in Runcorn on a message of you need to vote for us if you don't want a Reform MP, that seemed to work with some people who voted Liberal Democrat in that area at the election, but it didn't really appeal to Green voters. They didn't seem to really get much of a squeeze on the Green vote there. And I do worry that by trying to kind of appeal to the right or, you know, present yourself as a broad church or more centrist or whatever it is, there's a point where, you know, the voters who you've alienated on the left are too far gone and that message of trying to keep a Reform MP out just doesn't resonate with them anymore. And I think that's the danger of trying to like kind of consistently play both sides, is that eventually both sides might get tired of the message and it leaves you in a worse place than you were.
I suppose that goes back to Tony's point, doesn't it? Which is that if you learn the lessons of this set of local elections, you might be learning the wrong lessons for the next set of local elections where, as I understand it, Tony, a lot of the places we're going to be voting next year are places where Labour's primary challenge might well be from their left rather than from their right.
Especially in London.
Yeah,
I mean,
I have London in mind.
The Greens already have quite a substantial base in London. But of course, what Labour will be most worrying about is Wales, where if Reform do well, they might make it very difficult indeed for Labour to be able to have anything even close to a majority in the Senate. And whereas in Scotland, you know, Reform will do well enough to get into Holyrood. Under the proportional system in Wales, they're capable of doing well to becoming quite significant players.
I mean, I think you've got elections in a third of many metropolitan districts next year. Had those elections taken place this year, it looks from the Doncaster result as if quite a lot of them would have produced a good result for Reform this year. Birmingham's all out. You know, Birmingham, real problems. Not a great year for Labour to be fighting an election, even if the bins are clear and everything's sorted out by then. Then in London, it's clear that Labour face Reform in places like Barking and Dagenham and Havering. They face the Liberal Democrats in, you know, Haringey and Southwark. They face the Greens in Camden, Lambeth and Hackney. And then independents, you know, this new independents in places like Redbridge who are munching up the Labour vote. So, and Greens, you've got Greens, Conservatives in some places as well. So they're going to be fighting on 5 fronts in London next year, 5.
Yeah, it's worth saying because it hasn't really been noticed. There weren't very many wards polling on Thursday with relatively high Muslim populations, but where they were, Labour came in proper and independent candidates did well. The Muslim problem from Labour's point of view is still very firmly there.
And to that point, what's going on in the Middle East politically it clears to be going on and on.
Yeah.
So it's not going to disappear from consciousness, it would appear. I mean, it's much more important than that. But in terms of UK politics, it has that further effect.
Yeah. Is there any evidence at all of a Trump effect? You know, we've seen in the elections in Canada or the elections in Australia that there seems to be some sort of effect on sort of decreasing the vote for the populist right.
Well, no, partly because nobody has adopted the Mark Carney strategy of calling Trump out, because the Labour government is desperate.
Ed Davey has.
Ed Davey has, yes, but we've not had the government trying to do so, nor the Conservatives, because of course they tend to be Atlanticist. I mean, reforms I mean, it's difficult. The trouble is, it's difficult to unravel. Reform support basically began to plateau in the polls about the middle of February. Now, insofar as some of the more criticized aspects of Trump are post that, you might expect reform to go down, but there isn't any evidence that reform has been going down. And these local elections certainly don't give any indication that. Yes, Ed Davey is the one person who's been willing to call it out. Well, I mean, the Lib Democrats have arguably edged up a wee bit in the last few weeks, but not in the kind of way that's affected either Canadian or Australian politics. It doesn't seem to be having that kind of resonance. I mean, it is interesting how reform has so far been insulated from the Trump effect.
Yeah. Let me just say that Jill Rutter's just written a really interesting blog comparing Canada and Australia and their electoral outcomes, which is well worth a read. But Hannah, talk about Ed Davey. How pleased should the Lib Dems be with their performance last week?
Yeah, I mean they did really well, particularly in the areas that they also did well in the general election. In the south, I mean in Devon and Cornwall, they did incredibly well, which is probably what they were expecting. And I think, yeah, they can be pleased with that result. One thing that I was just thinking about as you were talking there is that these events, such as a Trump or whatever it might be, tend to sort of have, or they have the potential to have more of an effect now that voters don't have the same loyalties that they used to. And so actually, by the time we're already talking about the next local election and the next general election, but actually by the time they come around, what has happened then, even in the recent weeks leading up to those elections, could have a really big impact on how people vote, because they're not necessarily thinking of their identity anymore in the same way that they used to, and they're not necessarily even thinking about who they voted for last time. They're sort of more judging it at the situation as it stands, and so that could be a benefit for Labour come the next local elections if they're doing well then, or if they're still in the same position that they are now, then yeah, it could be really difficult for them.
So I mean, voters are in that sense more like sort of picky consumers. They're not sort of attached to particular brands in the way that they used to be, but are more willing to pick and choose.
Yeah. Broadly speaking, I mean, there's a lot of sort of negative partisanship. So there's a lot of parties that people really don't like and definitely wouldn't vote for. But the available options after that are definitely expanding, which is one of the reasons we do see this fragmentation and these massive shifts between parties and these huge majorities overturned, because people don't necessarily have that same attachment that they once did to their vote or their party that they've always voted for.
What a time to be in your line of work, John.
Yeah, I mean, Liberal Democrats, a slightly different take. It's really a case, much as in the general election, of doing well in seats, but not doing particularly impressively in terms of votes and being beneficiaries of the woes of others. So if you take, it doesn't really matter which measure you use, whether you compare it with May 2021 or in the limited opportunities that are available with 2024, their votes up by somewhere between 1 and 2 points. It's a very modest improvement. The principal reason why the Liberal Democrats do so well, one is that, of course, there are places like Oxfordshire where they already had a relatively large share of the vote. So with the Conservative vote collapsing, remember the Conservative vote is down by 20 points as compared with May 2021. The Liberal Democrats in some places are going to be the beneficiaries. And the second thing, as I was alluding to earlier, the Liberal Democrats were largely insulated from the rise of reform, because in places where the Democrats were strong, that's where reform found it most difficult to do, because the places where the Liberal Democrats are strong are very heavily, and they advanced are heavily pro-Remain. And therefore, one of the consequences of that is that basically, with the exception of Buckinghamshire, where the Tories still came first in votes, the 6 or 7 councils that where reform were not first, it's the Liberal Democrats who were first. So although the Liberal Democrats were third in terms of the votes cast across all these councils, they come second in terms of the number of councils in which they were in the lead. And in those councils, surprise, surprise, in exactly the same way as the electoral system benefited reform where they were first, the Liberal Democrats, where they were first, also benefit from the electoral system. And because their vote actually, I mean, their vote varied from council to council to a much greater extent. So Liberal Democrat vote, again, it's the same irony as in 2024. The party that for years has suffered from having a geographically evenly spread vote now has a geographically more concentrated vote than everybody else. Therefore, despite coming third in terms of votes, the electoral system operated in their favour. You know, even across all the councils, you know, Reform benefit from the system, Liberal Democrats benefit from the system, Conservative and Labour lose out, right? And again, so insofar as we're thinking about the future of the two-party system, here is a very, very clear warning to Conservative and Labour. If indeed you're not first and second in terms of votes, the first past the post system will not rescue you. Rather, it will exaggerate the scale of your decline.
Interesting. And Sophie, I mean, we haven't talked about them, and these were probably the wrong set of local elections to really think about how well they're doing on the back of their electoral success. But where did the Greens come out this time?
I mean, yeah, I mean, this was probably a round of locals where, you know, the Greens might not necessarily expected to make a huge amount of gains anyway. But I mean, they did in part of the country, like, you know, Gloucestershire, I think Northamptonshire as well. They did manage to win over some seats from the Conservatives. And I think it really kind of gets to the heart of, I think if you kind of compare the places where the Greens have managed to win some council seats this year to next year, it really gives you an idea of kind of how broad that coalition that they've managed to draw together is. And we've already seen that in the MPs that they have in Parliament who represent, after this election, very kind of different types of constituencies. And I think the challenge for the Greens is how do you balance electorates like, you know, Bristol, London, very, you know, young, quite left-wing, socially liberal, student educated, with, you know, Tory farmers in the south of England, basically. Like, how do you manage to bring up policies that please both of those electorates? And I mean, the Lib Dems have shown that there is a way, you know, you can do that. In the past, they're much more kind of, as John said, kind of concentrated, electorally efficient. Now there is ways you can do that by being hyper local, but I think it does kind of present an idea of the difficulty that the Greens will face over the next few years as they try and build that electoral coalition.
And just on their issues, I mean, it's interesting that Richard Tice sort of majored on net zero and has been sort of really stressing net zero as an issue where reform can make some progress. Was there any evidence of whether that is a vote winner for them in this campaign? And do we think looking forward that that is going to become a sort of axis of contestation which reform can benefit from?
Well, the point is that the Greens and Reform are at the two far ends of our current political spectrum, right? Yeah. So on the culture wars issues, the Greens are very socially liberal and the Reformers are very socially conservative. And yes, of course, also on the green issue. So the answer to you is that both parties might potentially be able to profit from the issue, because in both cases they essentially help them. Their respective core markets have very, very different views on the issue. It's just that so far the reform are the bigger of the two challenges. But the more our politics focuses on issues other than economic equality, the better the news it is for both the Greens and for Reform.
And I think if we were advising the Greens how to play this, they can be their socially liberal, progressive selves, in libertarian selves in cities, but actually Labour's going to give them some help with fighting developing on green land and all of that. So I think you can have different kinds of Greens in urban and rural areas who can do what the Liberal Democrats were always accused of doing, which is to have different platforms in different places. But frankly, you know, I think Greens in conservative areas, in rural areas, have plenty of green issues, but they're slightly different to the green issues that play out in cities.
It'd be fun to go to a Green Party conference and watch them meet each other, though, wouldn't it? And see what they.
But in fairness, it's not unique. It's not unique to it.
No, not at all.
I say this with three people who know more about it than me in the room. But all these parties now have voter bases which are impossible to deliver consistent policy to. Much worse than the past, surely. Much more difficult than in the past.
Would everyone agree with that? That the sort of coalitions that the parties have are just far harder to manage
Well,
than they
that's
would
one way of thinking about it. But the other consequence, I mean, insofar as you're moving to an era of multi-party politics, then it becomes easier to pursue niche markets. I would argue Reform are pursuing a niche market. It's quite a big niche market, but it's still a niche market. Greens are also very much pursuing a niche market. The point is, it's Conservative and Labour who are not trying to appeal to niche markets, and much good it's doing them at the moment.
So is your point basically that if you can win on high 20% of vote share, then actually your coalition can be more coherent?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, but the point, if you also look at the structure of their support, right, the demographic and ideological structure of Reform and Green support is the most clearly demarcated. Right, they're not appealing across the broad spectrums of the elect. I mean, we're right. We've got these two Green MPs who represent, you know, Tory constituencies, but they are those Green successes are very much the exception than the rule. If you actually look at where the Green vote came from at the last general election and where the character of the places they represent, the socially progressive, young, professional city constituencies far dominate. Those two wins in Tory areas really stand out like a sore thumb. They are, of course, the product of local government activity, and it may well be that they will be able to do this elsewhere. But of course, the county council elections more difficult for Reform because the wards are so much bigger, and therefore it's much more difficult for them to get the degree of focus on a particular district that's given them in some places like Stroud the ability to really become significant players locally.
Just one specific question for you, actually, John, which I noticed sort of over the weekend. You refer to Reform UK as a Eurosceptic party, which is obviously true. They're not great fans of the European Union, but is that the most appropriate descriptor of them? I mean,
well, I gather Stephen Bush wasn't too happy. I mean, I was just trying to use a generic term to refer to UKIP stroke Brexit party stroke Reform, because one of the things that you wanted to do as results come in was to not just compare Reform's support over the last 4 years, but to compare it with, as it were, the whole lineage of, if you prefer, anti-EU as opposed to Eurosceptic, but parties who are essentially defined by their attitudes towards the EU. I think Stephen Bush understood what I meant, even if he disagreed with my terminology. And the point, and it's worth saying here, if you actually compare for the places that polled this time and polled back in 2013, support for Reform is about 13 points higher than UKIP achieved at the height of their local government success back in 2013. And I think that perhaps is the more important point to grapple onto as opposed to issues of terminology.
I suppose the other interesting question here, Sophie or Hannah, either of you two on this, is what we compare Reform UK to, or who we compare them to. If you look across, it might be the United States, it might be across other European parties. I mean, is there a family we can sit them in? I mean, should we call them populist right? How would we describe the party in more generic terms if we don't say Eurosceptic? Hannah, do you want to go? I did it.
Yeah, sure.
What I said I wouldn't do there. Sorry.
Yeah. I think there's no doubt that obviously Nigel Farage is very much Eurosceptic and has built his entire political career sort of on that. So yeah, it's not unfair to characterize those parties that he's been heavily involved in as Eurosceptic parties. But especially as they sort of expand to become more than single issue, which you can, very much argue that UKIP were for almost the entirety of their life, at least that's how voters would have thought of them, then yeah, perhaps the, populist right would be a more appropriate party group, whether it's, we could get into sort of all of the different ones across Europe, but I wouldn't necessarily say that they are populist radical right at the moment, but that populist right is probably, the correct thing to say rather than, Eurosceptic now.
Okay, anything to
add? The difficulty, of course, with all this terminology is that Farage will push back very strongly if you try to describe Reform as far right, and he will point to his opposition to Tommy Robinson and his wish to keep ex-BNP folk out of Reform. So this is I know where to some degree you have to tread slightly, with a degree of care, because Farage does have some evidence to support his argument that you shouldn't necessarily suggest, for example, that reform are the same as the AfD in Germany.
Tony.
And I, there's no doubt all the variants of this sort of politics in European countries seem to look to me to be different. But we just take an issue like I mean, the reform voter base, and therefore part of the reform offer has now to be protectionist. Though many of its leaders were pro-free trade and Brexit was all about Singapore on Thames, they're now going to have, like Donald Trump, to be very cautious because of their voter base. And the most intriguing thing to me about the Donald Trump tariff approach, trying to protect jobs in the United States, it's not unlike a Benite policy from the 1970s, because that's exactly what economists in the 1970s wanted to do, to protect British car industries and British white goods manufacturers from exports. So politics has come a long way.
Yeah, buy British. I remember.
I'm backing Britain, as Bruce Forsyth famously sang.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Just, I mean, so my subtext to your question, I suppose, John, is that any of you, doesn't have to be John that answers this, are we calling this party Eurosceptic because we can't think of what else to call it legitimately? Is because there isn't.
No, you can call it anti-EU if you want.
Well, no, but moving away from
I don't think it's worth. I mean, I don't think anybody is going to disagree that there is a lineage from UKIP to the Brexit Party to reform. You can choose whatever term you want. The crucial point is, do we accept that it is reasonable to compare the performance of reform with the performance of UKIP and others? I mean, the evidence I've seen so far, I think there's a bit of a difference in the character. It looks to me, on what I've seen, and I was interested to hear what Sophie has said earlier, but certainly at the time of the general election, it strikes me that probably support for reform was more economically right-wing than that for UKIP. UKIP support was definitely never economically right-wing. Aspects of reform support, at least, certainly economically right-wing, and certainly rather more inclined to be small state than was the support for UKIP 10 years ago.
No, I absolutely take your point. It just, on the surface, something strikes me as a bit strange in an election where no one talked about Brexit, in a time when we've left the European Union.
Yeah,
that is the descriptor we use, because actually it's not. I mean, I take it in terms of lineage, absolutely, that's where you are. But in terms of how you describe the party, in terms of what they're talking about now, it's not really front and center, is it? The European.
Well, I mean, no, sorry. I mean, the people who support reform and the people who occupy reform are amongst the people who feel that the last Conservative government screwed up Brexit because they failed to deliver.
But it
is an issue for them. It's the failure of the last government to take the advantages of Brexit.
Yeah. I think the other issue is that nomenclature, I mean, the concept far right in Britain has a sort of slight ring to it. I think that's why trying to find terms to describe Reform UK, to the right of the Conservative Party, but not on all issues. That's the difficulty. They doesn't, these words, it's hard to find a precise location for them.
Particularly when they drift left on the economic stuff. I mean, then it becomes very, very confusing. I mean, one macro question that comes out of this, I suppose, is whether our electoral system is now fit for purpose. If you have 5-party competition going on, and you have a situation where you really can be elected on a frighteningly low share of the vote. I mean, is both the practical and the normative case for some kind of electoral reform? Surely it's becoming stronger, isn't it? I mean, Hannah, you're nodding. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it goes back to the question of why you choose a particular electoral system. I mean, what first past the post does is it produces decisive governments most of the time. So even though the vote share, then the number of votes that might be won on is very small, there's still the Labour landslide or, Reform coming out with nearly 700 seats this time. So if that's why you're choosing an electoral system, or one of the reasons why, then it's still performing its function. Whereas if you're doing it for popular support or for proportional representation sort of terms, then no, it's not performing it to the same degree that it used to be.
Anyone else got any thoughts on The
I mean,
electoral
courtesy of Election Maps UK, others may have seen this. I was informed that the lowest winning vote share in the local elections was 18.9% in a ward in Truro, Morrisk and Trehavern, if I pronounce that. Apologies if I haven't. With Reform on 17, Conservatives on 17, Greens on 14, Independents on 13 and Labour on 11. So that, if that's a harbinger, a sense of where we're headed, it's going to make even MRP polls work hard to get constituency by constituency results right, is it not?
not more incumbent ones, surely. They'll
Well,
be
surely not. No, theirs will be.
Well,
That-
I mean, on that note, it is worth saying that, well, I mean, something we haven't talked about, and we should. Again, if you want to understand why Conservative and Labour lost so many seats, both parties saw their vote fall more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. Right. Now, in part, that's simply a function of the scale of the loss that they were suffering, but it's also a consequence of the fact that, you know, the rise of Reform occurred primarily in Tory territory, and they primarily were scooping up the Tory vote. And equally, you know, Labour were, although the Greens didn't do brilliantly, where the Greens did do relatively well, it is certainly Labour that suffered. But the point is, under our single member party electoral system, the one thing you do not want to do is to see your vote go down more heavily in places where previously strongest. And in a sense, you know, the Conservatives have just had that same medicine twice, because that's what happened to them in 2024. But Labour have now also had example of that medicine. And the thing about the single member plurality electoral system, and the real lesson of 2024, and it's underlined by these elections, is that the relationship between seats and votes, it's partly a function of relative position rather than absolute position, but crucially, it's also a function of the geographical distribution of your support. Yeah. And the challenge, I think, for those who wish to continue to defend the system is to come up with a democratic theory that says the outcome that we get at a national level and the kind of government we therefore get should depend on the geographical distribution of party support. If it's a national judgment, why should geography matter?
Okay. Yeah. Sophie, is it fair to say that Reform voters are still predominantly old and I think predominantly male?
I mean, I think the sort of preliminary evidence we've got is that is diversifying slightly. I mean, I think that's partly just because, you know, it's a function of the fact that Reform is broadening its support, and you've got people who, you know, didn't vote for the party in the general election, who voted for other parties, be it Labour or the Conservatives, who are fed up with the two main parties and have been over to them. So I would say it's probably more of a function of, you know, people being fed up with the main two parties, as opposed to Reform now being incredibly successful at appealing to, you know, women or whatever other demographic. I think they're just better able to maybe win over the support of people who had voted for those parties and who are irritated at Labour's performance in government so far, the Tories' inability to recover under Kemi Badenoch, all those kinds of things. So I think it's diversified slightly, but not because of any kind of targeted approach.
Right. I mean, am I right in saying still that one of the striking differences between Reform and other, whatever we're going to call them, parties in Europe is that Reform have been relatively unsuccessful in attracting younger voters, whereas if you look in the Netherlands, for instance, Wilders was incredibly successful at attracting younger voters. Is that still the case, do you think, that they're relatively weaker there?
I think if you look at the general election, I've not looked at the age split for the locals this time around, but at the general election, you know, we saw people talking quite a lot about making inroads with young men, and I think, you know, they certainly did better maybe than UKIP or Brexit Party ever did, but they're still polling a very small amount, and at the same time, you know, a lot of young women are moving to the left and voting for parties like the Greens too, so there's that kind of like gender mix into it as well, the younger stage category. I mean, I think it is still predominantly quite an old older party, is it not?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. No, I mean, I've certainly been tracking YouGov's evidence. So you're obviously acquainted with more in comments. I mean, YouGov's evidence suggests that support for Reform is just as demographically structured as it was back in 2024, and that actually, if anything, some of the biggest increases in support have been amongst amongst demographic groups where they were already relatively strong, and that therefore, as a result, the age gap has widened. There is also a gender gap. So yes, therefore, young men are more likely to support reform than a young woman, but neither group is particularly likely to support reform. I mean, the clue again comes from Brexit. Brexit was an older people's cause. Reform, I mean, the level of support for reform, I mean, Reform were the most popular party amongst Brexiteers, right, by a far long country mile. Those polls that do the breakdown, and unfortunately most polls don't do it these days, are coming up with 40% plus support for reform amongst people who voted for Brexit in 2016. It's in single figures amongst Remainers. All right. So although the parties don't want to talk about this subject, Brexit as a signifier of a wider set of cultural value differences is still a major division within our politics. The Labour Party will wish it were not so, but the Labour Party failed between 2019 and 2024 to reconnect with working class Leave voters. They had very little success in that project, and therefore, as a result, they are still finding themselves trying to straddle a divide that in many respects is dividing the electorate.
Well, what a way to end, eh? There's the clip for social media. It's all about Brexit. Always was, always will be. Superb. We like that. All in favour. For now, though, Hannah, Sophie, Tony, John, thanks ever so much. That was fascinating. I think we began to scratch the surface. We could have gone on for another hour there quite easily. We will have you back before long to touch base on the electoral situation. But for the moment, have a great day. Thanks for your time. And thanks you all for tuning in and watching. Take care. Bye-bye.